So my name is Corey McCall. I'm Associate Professor of Philosophy at Elmira College in upstate New York, and I'm also President of the Foundation for Philosophy of Creativity. The foundation was incorporated in 1957 by William S. Minor, who was a professor at West Virginia University and then the Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. He was at SIU from 1964 through 1981 in the Communication Studies Department, but he was also interested in philosophy and aesthetics and creativity. And he incorporated this foundation to further the study of creativity, especially the philosophical study of creativity. And in recent years, we've been hoping to keep his legacy alive by hosting and supporting lectures like this one, the Hahn Lecture, and nurturing scholars who do work in creativity studies. And it is our honor and pleasure to be able to help support this lecture and the continuing activities here at the AIPCT. So,
excellent. Thank you. All right, so what this is it's the Lewis Hahn Lecture. And this is the 5th installment of that lecture series. Lewis Hahn was a professor at SIUC from 1961 until his retirement in 2000. But before that, he had had a full career at Washington University, St. Louis. What happened was that we had a president at SIUC named Delight Morris who realized that there was a tremendous opportunity, and this is how Bill Minor also came to be at SIU. There's a tremendous opportunity in the fact that many universities had a mandatory retirement age at 65. And so when people hit 65 and retired, many of them still had a lot of years left in them. And that included Bill Minor and Paul Arthur Shilp, and there were so many, the list goes on and on. Lewis Hahn had retired from Washington University in St. Louis and came here and taught another 35 years. He was born in 1908, got his PhD from Berkeley in 1939, and he taught at Washington University in St. Louis from 1939 to 1960 something. But in any case, he came here when he was forced retired. That used to be legal. It was a philosophy professor who changed that law. Do you remember that, Ken? Paul Weiss. Paul Weiss sued Yale University for forced retiring him and won the case. And that was part of the reason you can't force retire a professor anymore. And some people would say that that's a mixed blessing. But what I would say is that SIUC benefited tremendously from the fact that Delight Morris, the president, recognized that a lot of people who are 65 years old, especially philosophers, have an awful lot left in them. And so Bill Minor came here, and Lewis Hahn came here, and Paul Arthur Shilp came here, and Henry Nelson Wyman came here, and there were a number of other folks who came to SIU as a result of that. Lewis Hahn then served the Creativity Society as its secretary-treasurer from its founding in 1957 until 2000, when he passed that job on to me. He passed a bunch of jobs on to me, but I guess it comes to that point where you say, hey, you take this on. And I've been the treasurer of the Creativity Society ever since then. But one of the things that we did was the Foundation for the Philosophy of Creativity decided to start a lecture series. It's about 2012 when we decided to do this, and to do it as Bill Minor left to us a very generous endowment, and to do it as in the middle of the summer to see whether or not in not competing with everything else, if we could draw a crowd. And generally speaking, that has happened. 2 years ago, we made the decision on the foundation board to expand this so that we would honor a Hahn lecturer, which is Ken Snickers, and I'm going to talk about him later this evening, that we would honor a Hahn lecturer by asking somebody who's in the early career of some kind of intellectual pursuit, somebody who's in the mid-career, to come and talk about the work of that person. And so the Hahn Lectures becomes a series of 3 lectures, and this is the second year that we've done it this way. Last year's Hahn lecturer was Doug Anderson, and some of you were here as John Kaag and Stephen Miller gave pictures. Ah, they did. It was so picturesque. They gave lectures on Doug's thought. This year, our honoree is Ken Snickers, and we have Zach Thanasilangkul and also Mike Schlieder are going to come and give our lectures this afternoon, and they're going to talk about economics and the things that are important to Ken Snickers. So that's what this is, and I'm not going to pause on it that much longer because you've heard too much information, except that you haven't heard about our first speaker. Zach Thanasilangkul was a philosophy and economics major at SIUC. That's where I first met him. That's where Ken first met him. He had transferred to us from a college in Michigan that shall not be named. But let's just say it's a very exclusive private school. And the very first conversation I had with Zach, and he told me where he had gone in Michigan and that he had transferred to SIUC. I said, I do believe that's the first time I've ever heard that particular story, that you came from that college and decided to go to SIUC. We were the beneficiaries of his decision to transfer because I had Zach as a student and Ken had Zach as a student, and he greatly enriched the classes that he was a part of. He is now pursuing a master's degree in economics at the University of Denver, having to choose between philosophy and economics, philosophy, economics. He chose economics, and I don't blame him. But that said, I want to introduce and turn it over to Zach Thanasilangkul and make him feel welcome.
Yeah. Sweet, thank you everyone for inviting me here, and this is quite the honor, as I hope you'll see. I'm such a proud alumni of not just of SIU, but of the philosophy department. Specifically, these 2 bookends here in the front have really shaped me, I think, as a scholar and as a person, and I hope that comes through in the talk. So what I'm hoping to do is maybe give something of a shorter presentation and have a lot of time for discussion, as I think our philosophical interests are more inclined towards discussion-based conversations. I was trying to say a lot when I first wrote this paper, and then I narrowed it down, and like I said, I think if there are any holes or anything, hopefully we can open that up in Q&A. So this is Toward Ethical Economies, or How to Move On After Killing Your Mother. Starbucks isn't the place I expected to first meet Ken Snickers, but I didn't know how to tell him that I didn't support prison labor or terrible coffee. I spent 5 years in my undergrad at 3 separate universities across the Midwest, SIU comprising the final 2. The first reason I chose to attend SIU was that since I grew up in Rockford, just south of the Wisconsin border, I could receive in-state tuition while feeling like I was in a different part of the country. I had no idea. Second, the philosophy department had a pluralist and heavily continental focus, made up of individuals whose pictures portrayed them as an odd bunch, to say the least. One person particularly piqued my interest, and we all know by now that it was Dr. Ken Snickers. He was a continental philosopher from DePaul who seemed to specialize in everything I thought was cool: Foucault, phenomenology, and the philosophy of economics. I wasn't quite sure how one could apply the passion and sentiments of continental philosophy to the study of the economy. Having studied economics as a second major in undergrad and now pursuing it at the graduate level, albeit in a very heterodox department, I can tell you that economics, the formal study of what we call the economy, truly proves itself to be the dismal science at every turn. Contrary to popular belief, especially those of economists, the discipline of economics is outdated, largely uninteresting, and, to be honest, irrelevant to how people live their everyday lives. Economist in training right here. What would a radical philosopher like Ken Snickers have to say about the way we study the economy? I knew I wanted to find out, so I came. Dr. Stickers had been teaching abroad during my first year at SIU, but he promised that he would reach out to me when he returned to the US. He did, along with that invitation to meet him at Starbucks. I accepted with enthusiasm. It was there, nestled in a booth by the door, that I realized how much respect and admiration I would have for him. Telling me of his friendship with Deidre McCloskey, their shared, quote, irreverence toward the discipline, and his long conversion to a beautiful style of the Catholic faith, I felt that I had, for the first time, met someone who truly understood what I was feeling because he had felt it too. He and I shared a vision for a world bound by justice and governed by compassion, one that both of us will always be dedicated to creating. 3 years and 2 degrees later, I find myself carrying on an academic project similar to his own, inflected by my own philosophical interests and the experience of growing up in the post-2008, undeniably ethical economy. I won't spend a lot of time trying to summarize Dr. Stickers' work, since most of us in the room are probably at least a little familiar with it already. What I will say is that his research on the philosophy of economics in particular, as I see it, is centered around 2 major tasks. The first task is to rethink the ethical foundations of both economics as a discipline and the economy as a social sphere. Many of us will recall that economics, as we know it, is a rather recent phenomenon, but the roots of the discipline in the Western world lie in ancient Greece. In fact, the word economics comes from a combination of the Greek words oikos and nomos, translating it to something like the management of the home. From Aristotle to Aquinas and all the way into the 18th century, economists were better known as moral philosophers. Their theories emphasized decision-making not in the marginal cost-benefit analysis heralded by mainstream economists today, but in the sense of moral action directed from one person to another. Their writings confronted issues of justice, dignity, community, and human flourishing, altogether gesturing toward the ancient questions of the good life and the good society. Most scholars tend to think that everything changed with Adam Smith, whose 1776 publication of The Wealth of Nations established for the first time the study of the economy as a discipline separate from philosophical inquiry. In it, he talks about self-interest rather than benevolence as the driving force behind economic activity. He proposes ideas like the invisible hands and the division of labor, which still serve as the foundation for mainstream economics today. But a look beyond 1776 reveals that Smith was anything but a mere value-free economic scientist. Works like The Theory of Moral Sentiments and his lectures on jurisprudence directly confront the ethical foundations of economy and society with serious rigor. How then did economists, who look to Adam Smith as the father of their discipline, or our discipline if I have to, stop thinking of themselves as moral philosophers? How did economists, in Stickers' own words, commit matricide? At the heart of this issue lies more than the oft-debated dichotomy of positive and normative science, economics and ethics. And here is the second task that Stickers' work presents to us. Understanding the separation of economics from moral philosophy as a historical phenomenon might show us how economics can once again become an ethical project. Stickers looks to Polanyi in centering the Great Transformation around the enclosure movement in England. However, his analysis of the Great Transformation goes beyond the commonplace analysis, in which economic production simply shifted from community provision to the drive for profit. For Stickers, enclosure didn't merely signal a material shift. Rather, it signaled a refusal of economic forces to be constrained by traditional morality and law. As Stickers describes in his article, The Great Matricide, How Economic Science Murdered Moral Philosophy, in the feudal society immediately preceding capitalism in England, feudal lords inherited a social responsibility to protect and care for the serfs who tended to their land. With enclosure, the commons became private property with the right to exclusion, and the emerging bourgeoisie bore no obligation to people who were displaced. The modern state arose then not only to defend the right of private property, but also to fill the moral void created by this bourgeois refusal to bear the responsibilities that had been entrusted to feudal lords. Hence, we see that the separation of economics from ethics, Stickers writes, began with economic forces, the rise of this new class, the bourgeoisie, pulling themselves free from moral constraint. Initially, the constraints of tradition, custom, and religion, but later also from the constraints of law and moral philosophy, which they would claim to be interferences in the efficiencies of free markets and the invisible hand. This analysis, in my view, is similar to that of Marxist historian Ellen Wood, whom I love very dearly, who, in her wonderful book, The Origins of Capitalism, argues that enclosure was the result of contingent market imperatives in England and the emergence of economic means of surplus extraction as apart from non-economic ones. In her account, much like Stikkers, the Great Transformation accompanied a new economic logic, a qualitative break from what had come before. Economic theory, in its various forms, has tried to make sense of this conceptual and historical movement in various ways. Sometimes justification, sometimes a challenge, sometimes both. But this is what I find to be the appeal of Marxian and Marxist theory. Its critique of bourgeois historians and what Marx calls the vulgar economists confronts the contradiction of neoclassical and otherwise mainstream theory, which claims to divorce positive science from ethics while actually becoming, in Stikkers' words, the dictator of a new normativity, a normativity ruled by the imperatives of growth, efficiency, and optimality. This theoretical acknowledgement is the reason that I want to encourage those seeking answers to the question of how economics divorced itself from ethics to consider a point of view rooted in this Marxist historical account, but coupled with contemporary philosophical insights largely derived from post-structuralist, feminist, and queer theory. More importantly, I believe that this point of view can guide us toward a project where economics and the foundations of the economy become always an ethical phenomenon. This kind of theoretical framework I want to propose is a kind of anti-essentialist Marxism, or a Marxian-inflected anti-essentialism, if you prefer. I argue that considering this position, even temporarily, can help those of us engaged in economics and the philosophy thereof in assisting Stikkers' project, and to move on, so to speak, from killing our mother. So, the argument. I'm not going to try to convince you now that an anti-essentialist Marxism is the philosophical framework we should all be adopting as the correct theory. To do so would be counter to its own project. Anti-essentialist Marxism isn't a claim to capital T truth. It doesn't assert a knowledge of ontology or the way the world really is, as many philosophers and economists are completely obsessed with doing. Rather, anti-essentialist Marxism affirms itself as one point of many to consider, a partial knowledge in an infinite array of perspectives. I encourage us to encounter this framework first as something like a thought experiment. What I hope to do now then is briefly sketch the anti-essentialist position and show you what's at stake for taking it seriously, then conclude by providing a rejoinder to Stikkers' work and its lasting relevance. To really see the value of adopting an anti-essentialist position, we first have to buy into the following claim. We live in a historically special, opportune time. What I mean is that there are all sorts of alternative practices and economic experiments whose very mission and intention it is to create just economies and flourishing communities happening all around us just right now. And as a side note, as Stikkers and some of you will know, over half of the worker cooperatives in the United States have been created and proliferated since the year 2000. The mother-grown cooperatives appeared sort of in the middle of the 20th century, and so these things are a pretty recent phenomenon, which I think is exciting. So hopefully we can all buy into that claim. Whether it be ventures like worker cooperatives and community land trusts, or communal practices in families, neighborhoods, jazz bands, people everywhere are challenging the dominance of a capitalist form of society. That is to say that in the real world, individuals and communities are pushing back against the idea of economic action free of moral and ethical concerns. How should we as radical social philosophers, philosophers of the economy, or what have you, make sense of such a thing? And here's the major point I want to make. The way we talk about things is never just talking. Instead, the stories we tell and the narratives we adopt are discursive choices. They engender possibility and reveal what we believe in and the kind of futures we think we can create. Anti-essentialist Marxists think that the way we've been talking about the economy is, at best, outdated. Adopting new stories and narratives, buying into the thought of experiment, can help us re-envision the economy as a compilation of multiple, complex, and coexisting ethical spaces. So what's at stake? What do we lose by failing to consider the anti-essentialist position? I want to argue three things here. First, we might altogether miss these experiments by continuing to operate with standard interpretations and rigid structural accounts. Second, we might interfere with them by bringing what J.K. Gibson Graham call the skeptical voice to these projects and prejudging them. Finally, a parallel idea, but one that is certainly related, we might actually perpetuate injustice, even in the absence of exploitation. I'll return to these concerns after briefly sketching the framework I'm advocating for. If we can ascribe any tenets to anti-essentialist Marxism, or a Marxian-inflected anti-essentialism, they might be best represented as answers to a series of questions. First, what is class? This work comes largely out of Resnick and Wolff's 1987 book, Knowledge and Class, in which the authors attempt to bring the Althusserian concept of overdetermination to the method of economics. Overdetermination, at least in this context, is simply a way of bracketing ontology, to get rid of our causal assumptions and ask, what if everything conditions everything else? When we adopt a new narrative, what are we able to see that we couldn't before due to our insistence on figuring out the way the world really is? The insight here is that class, perhaps the fundamental object of concern to any project rooted in Marxian thought, is an overdetermined process. Most scholars, both Marxist and non-Marxist, tend to think of classes as social groups. The haves and the have-nots, to use a simple example. In orthodox Marxian thought, the classes of capitalist and laborer are demarcated by those who produce surplus and those who appropriate it. Very simply. The anti-essentialist position, on the other hand, sees individuals caught in a complex process of production, appropriation, and distribution, where they might embody multiple, coexisting, and even contradictory class positions. Feudal societies embody one form of the class process, slave societies embody another, and capitalist societies yet another. Further, each society is not dominated by one totalizing, all-encompassing hegemonic structure, as most Marxist accounts would have us believe. If you listen to most Marxists these days, there's nothing that hasn't been touched by capitalism, at least it seems to me. It's in our workplaces, our families, our relationships, even our bodies. We've been buried alive with no way out other than through overthrowing capitalism by revolution or dismantling it via reform. I've never been clear, I think, what reform means to most people, but the revolution or reform question has still remained. An anti-essentialist position instead envisions capitalism as one class process taking place among many. Other communal, even what some would call communist, class processes are simultaneously occurring all around us. We just learn to look. Finally, the concern for class is simply an entry point into a vast complex of social determinations. Aligned with the method of overdetermination and contrary to orthodox Marxist perspectives, class does not possess any more explanatory power than things like race, gender, or anything else. Remember that we've bracketed the strict ontology and the question. We've bracketed strict causality in the question of ontology for the moment. Some people are just more inclined to talk about class due to our personal experiences, those of us who have faced class and economic oppression. Maybe our academic education has led us in that direction, or whatever else. Class-based perspectives are simply a few of an infinite number of entry points into discussions regarding social justice. Second, what does justice mean in terms of class? I think that this bears less relevance to Stickers' own project and the one at hand, so I'll be brief. Hopefully, if need be, we can open up more in Q&A. When most Marxists think about the necessary and sufficient conditions for achieving something that we might be able to call justice, we tend to think of ending exploitation. Exploitation, to be simple, occurs in the capitalist mode of production when workers produce surplus value, but they aren't the ones who appropriate it. If those who produce were also the ones who appropriate, no exploitation would take place, at least not in this account, and by most orthodox accounts, we would be content with calling this a just situation. However, this ignores the distribution piece of the class process, as George DiMartino argues in his seminal 2003 paper in Rethinking Marxism. So those of us doing sort of this new form of class justice are following this paper, and also Volume 3 of Capital, where Marx, the oft-neglected Volume 3, where Marx really gets into the distribution piece. An anti-essentialist Marxist conception of class justice has to consider exploitation, but DiMartino reminds us that Marx's affirmation of from each according to his ability to each according to his need also gives us an ethical mandate of deciding who exactly produces, how much should be produced, how surplus gets distributed, and who ends up distributing it. All this is to say that class justice entails more than simply ending exploitation. Third, what does political resistance look like from this anti-essentialist perspective? Here I'm pulling from a series of papers, including those titled Overdetermination, The Ethical Moment, again by DiMartino, and by J.K. Gibson Graham, Enabling Ethical Economies, and Ethics of the Local, and Imagining and Enacting Non-Capitalist Futures. If you can't tell from the titles alone, these people really care about theorizing ethics in the economy. One aspect of this resistance is that it involves local cultivation. The economy is, perhaps more than anything, a place of moral decision-making. The question for theorists and philosophers of economics then becomes whether the totality or the particularity comes first. Gibson Graham argue that, quote, there is no possibility for the global order in the first place, hinting to the notion that localities need to be thought of as self-determined and active subjects of their own economic experience. This also involves cultivating ourselves as what they call practitioners of the local. Drawing on Foucault's History of Sexuality, the process of subject formation entails a self-formation that takes place through practices of the self. This dual moment of morality serves as a template for thinking about the cultivation and constant re-articulation of an ethical local subject oriented toward location, interpersonal engagement, and the process of becoming. That is, when outlining a vision of an ethics of the local, we have to ask both what its core principles are, as well as how we might cultivate ourselves as practitioners of it. In anti-essentialist fashion, this position asks us to displace binaries as a condition for our resistance. These include the binaries of capitalist versus non-capitalist, economic versus non-economic, worker versus owner, and even capital versus labor. We have to look for ways in which the economy already embodies non-capitalist and otherwise alternative processes, alongside and in conjunction with capitalist ones. Witnessing these alternative practices will hopefully aid us in getting rid of the worn-out question of reform and revolution. Instead, resisting unjust social arrangements looks less like overthrowing a totalizing hegemony and more like enabling spaces that encourage the proliferation of difference. This is why Gibson Graham called their project one of queering the economy. When we acknowledge that the capitalist class process is just one existing alongside many, our challenge to it involves rethinking social innovations and radical economic experiments in ways that don't prejudge or stifle them. So by now, many of you have probably already considered the biggest and most obvious objection to the anti-essentialist position, something called the futility argument. In short, this objection claims that while these alternative experiments and practices might be worthwhile on their own, they are very cool, their small scale prevents them from offering a thorough challenge to capitalism. The response to this from anti-essentialist Marxists has tended to be something like the following. That's an interesting narrative, And if you want to pursue that, the narrative that capitalism is this giant totalizing thing looming in the sky above all of us, if you want to pursue that, go for it. But remember that narratives are discursive choices that enable some projects and eclipse others. Again, which comes first, the total or the local? The anti-essentialist position sees different kinds of opportunities, highlighting that this, more than anything, is a plea for visibility and recognition. Each narrative has its own implications for what is and isn't possible. An anti-essentialist method, drawing from the idea of overdetermination, opens the doors for new opportunities that we couldn't see before. This doesn't mean that anti-essentialist Marxism has everything figured out on its own. On the contrary, the situation is a bit complicated, to say the least. In 1999, Sharon Kashmir, herself a Marxist anthropologist, found that the Mondragon worker cooperatives in the Basque region of northern Spain actually eroded the strength of organized labor in the form of unions and subsequently diminished the community's capacity for class struggle. The contingencies of that region and its anti-fascist history made it such that, in this particular and contingent case, the proliferation of alternative practices actually did seem to be getting in the way of greater social transformation. More recently, political scientist Minson G found in her dissertation fieldwork that class consciousness played a significant role in the struggle to create just economies. While workers in cooperatives in her home country of Korea saw themselves sort of as part of a body politic of sorts, it was really, if you were in a worker cooperative in South Korea, you were militantly organizing. Co-op workers in the United States simply organized to maximize their individual economic opportunity. These are similar findings to recent qualitative research that I recently conducted at the Evergreen Cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio. When I asked co-op members if they saw their work as just a job or contributing to a movement, most workers said that it was just a job, albeit one of the better jobs that most of them have had. Even the workers who did say that they were part of something bigger or greater unanimously related the feeling to something like accomplishing ownership, individual ownership in the midst of poverty. No single conversation I had with workers involved topics like social injustice or class oppression. All this is to say that this thought experiment, if you will, is complex. However, the fact that we live in a special and opportune point in history, precisely at which a new theoretical framework can enable us to see it, is enough for me at least, to recognize that we share an ethical moment, as philosophers, of course, but also as members of communities. What discursive choices are we making? And what do they enable and prevent us from seeing? What are we each going to do to make room for voices, practices, experiments that have hitherto been judged and silenced? One thing I've always admired about Dr. Stickers is his commitment to rooting his philosophy in real, practical concerns. I remember him sitting in a presentation that Donnie McMahon gave to a group of fellow students, raising a question, quote, just to check, that Donnie wasn't engaging in so-called armchair phenomenology. Everything in Stickers' work on phenomenology, economy, pragmatism, religion, and a myriad of other subjects points toward a devotion toward making real life more meaningful for real people. Stickers' work has thus far done an incredible job of showing scholars in the field how economics divorced itself historically and conceptually from moral philosophy. And it has inspired many, including myself, to pursue work that advocates for a return of the study of economics to ethical concerns. The economy is, above all, a sphere of ethical decisions made by particular individuals and local communities. Stickers has demonstrated, with tremendous force, matricide. The task for the rest of us, then, is figuring out how to move on after killing our mother. Perhaps I'm a bit of a skeptic, but I don't think that moral philosophy as a field of inquiry is going to make any sort of serious comeback. So how can we take those central concerns of the good life, the good society, human flourishing, and just community, and make them the focus of our contemporary inquiry? I believe that adopting some sort of updated theoretical framework, one such as, but certainly not limited to, Antiessentialist Marxism, or a Marxian-inflected Antiessentialism, can reveal both theoretical challenges to positive science and non-normative theory, and real-world challenges to unjust political systems, class processes, and social arrangements. More importantly, it gives us a way to begin thinking of enabling ethical community economies and cultivating ourselves as practitioners of them. Building a relationship with Dr. Stickers and being exposed to his work hasn't been a first step for me as a scholar. It's been a launch pad. His academic rigor and compassionate direction alone are enough to make him a bit of a role model for me. It is one of my deepest aspirations to become as kind and gentle of a person and as forceful and urgent of a scholar as he is. To wrap things up, I want to share a line from Stickers' article, Emancipation from Capital, published in Pragmatism Today. I feel less bad about plagiarizing someone who's in the room. Stickers writes that, quote, "The emancipation from capital begins with those things of beauty, including gestures of kindness, friendship, and love, that remind us of our humanity and reaffirm those values within that humanity that transcend those of capital and even life itself." I have a difficult time coming up with better words on which to conclude. So, Dr. Stickers, thank you for supporting me and really for simply being on my side when I felt like sometimes no one else was. And I can't wait for you to see me grow. Thank you, everyone. I field questions.
Yes, questions.
I love robust and grilling discussion, so lay it on me.
Pete?
Yeah, is your non-essentialist Marxism a kind of pluralistic Marxism?
What do you mean by that?
Because the problems or the establishment that the Marxist wants to critique, you're going to come up with many-sided criticisms of it rather than one gigantic revolution.
Of course. Yeah, so I've been workshopping this idea. So I just presented at a social philosophy conference in the Bay Area 2 weeks ago, and I gave this talk. It was more aligned with the idea of class justice, and everyone in the audience was like, "Oh, this isn't Marxism. You are like ripping the urgency and like the toolkit that Marx gives us, and you're stripping everything Marxist away from this." And I said, "Well, would you guys have a problem with this if we called it a Marxian-inflected anti-essentialism?" And everyone was like, "Oh, that's a great idea." And I think that points, case in point about like narratives and stories being strong, right? We sort of hold Marx as this God figure, and even me sometimes, and these things that aren't Marxist are, it's like blasphemy to our religion. But on the other hand, I think our project is rooted in Marxian thought and this concern for class and justice and ending exploitation and such, but it's updated, right? It's not 1862. So I don't know. The idea of a pluralist of Marxism is something that I'm hesitant about, right? I think about people like Cohen and the analytical Marxist, right? They call themselves the no bullshit Marxist. And I look at that and I think, well, that's not helpful to anyone at all. And I think people probably look at my project the same way. So I don't know if I'd call it pluralist, but something more contemporary, perhaps. Does that make sense?
If not pluralist, then what?
That's a good question, right? As we're talking about particular knowledges and things like that, right? That idea is absolutely pluralist, right? That's
Yeah.
But I think to situate this line of thought in Marxist thought, I don't know. Perhaps it is.
Actually, I do have a question very specifically about that, because I think you avoid both the conception of need and the conception of material determination in what you're saying.
Yeah.
And that's probably why people were saying you're throwing out. I didn't hear anything about need, and I didn't hear anything about material need,
Yeah.
especially in what you were saying. And so I can understand why it is that if people who are Marxists, and I'm not one, if they heard what you were saying, they might think, like, what is this guy doing among us?
Yeah. Yeah. That's forceful. No, that's a good way of putting it.
It's not supposed to be a challenge because I don't have a dog in this fight.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I'm exactly where you're at, and I don't call myself an anti-essentialist Marxist or anything like that, because where I'm at as far as my development in this thought and my buy-in to this is really thinking about this as saying, hey, let's just put a break on everything. Let's bracket all this ontology stuff, and let's just think as a thought of experiment. Just think, what if, overdetermination, all these things. What do we start to see, right? If we operate under this rigid structuralism and base superstructure, whatever, we miss that things like worker cooperatives and community land trusts might present a very strong community-based challenge to capitalism. But I know what you're saying, right? My grad school education has been essentially getting hit over the head with volume 1. And so Marx is forceful, and the class is this determining drive. And even Marx's doctoral dissertation, which I've been exploring, was he wrote on atomism and Democritus and Epicurus. And so these ideas of metabolism, things like that, are all extremely materialist, right? They're nothing but materialist. If they're not materialist, they're not anything else. And so I'm having a hard time trying to say I want to buy into this, just saying what if, and where does this lead us? It's a really recent line of thought, and so I think a lot more work needs to be done pushing it to the limit. But I think something, just volume 1, and even volume 1 and volume 3, and volume 2 in the middle, right? It's not getting us very far anymore, I think. Go for it.
Okay, so one way to denaturalize the present is to look at old narratives that used to exist in the past. And if you look at, I think the last time there was really a good, strong, nationally understood narrative about worker cooperatives was the 1880s, when the Knights of Labor, who at the time were the largest and most important labor organization in the United States, organized around the idea of cooperatives and creating a cooperative commonwealth of interlocked consumer and producer cooperatives. And they had labor presses all over the country giving this messaging of wage labor is inherently wrong and needs to be replaced by cooperation. And that was a narrative that was actually very little informed by Marxism, even though Marx was writing and some people there knew of Marx. I recently read a book that argued kind of convincingly that the Knights of Labor were developing a kind of republican tradition, which goes back to ancient Rome, and it is based on ideals of non-domination, where wage labor is wrong because you're being kind of dominated by the will of your employer. So that's just another narrative that has existed, and actually for a time was quite popular, because you're talking about people who, in the 1880s, remember a time when most Americans were artisans or small farmers or petty proprietors of one kind or another, and people actually had economic independence, and capital in the form of land was widely available. And then they were transitioning to a time of industrialization where suddenly you got to work for somebody, and that seemed like a massive indignity. There was widespread outrage against the idea that we're all going to be wage laborers now.
Yeah, I would love to get that book recommendation from you. Immediately, I think my mind just jumped to even John Stuart Mill, right? Who is, not a Marxist. He says,
But a radical.
yeah. He says, wage labor was cool when workers were really uneducated and things like that. And but even Mill, right? Even Mill writing, he says that's not the case anymore. And so this wage labor relationship is totally illegitimate because workers are educated and we're all human now or something. And so yeah. But I'd love to bounce those ideas more. Yeah. Again, I think the thing is, right? Narratives matter, and it's not just pushing one narrative. I think it's trying to adopt and see through, multiple narratives and being conscious about it, right? I don't know. Yeah. What's up?
So why, so I'm going to put this kind of provocatively, but why do narratives matter? Or do narratives matter more than what people do? Because it seems like in your presentation there's this tension between actual practices on the ground, looking at these worker cooperatives and so on and so forth, what people actually do to concretely resist capitalist hegemony, versus the way people talk about it, versus the way even academics talk about it. So it seems like you're going to me at least, that you're going to sort of reinforce the futility argument if all we're doing is getting these arguments about whether this is Marxist or not, right? Whereas it seems like the most powerful part of what you're doing is actually looking at what people do, rather than what people say about what they do. So It seems like you want to focus on the narratives, but I say don't focus on the narratives, focus on the practices, right?
Sure.
and see how those practices resist, or maybe if these worker cooperatives don't actually do what the people on the ground think they're doing or what economists think they're doing. That's the interesting part, to me at least, and not what people are saying or the narrative. So why do you want to focus so much on the narratives, I guess is my question.
Yeah, I completely agree with you that at the least there's a lot of lost time arguing about whether this is Marxism or not, whether it's Marxian inflected or it is Marxism. At the end of the day, I don't really care what we call it. I think for me, it's hard to divorce narrative from practice, right? Stories, narratives, and things like that, right? They're the things that lead us to our choices, and that we tell ourselves stories about ourselves, and we participate in writing these community stories and stories about others, and those are the things that kind of demarcate the path of our actions and what's possible, what's off the path, things like that. But I do kind of enjoy what you're saying about looking more at the practices. There's a book, I think it's just called The Post-Capitalist Politics, I think by J.K. Gibson Graham again, and they have all this theoretical work, but then it's just a book where they say, hey, what are people doing now, And there's places like Cooperation Jackson and the Boston Ujima Project and things like that, that maybe those would be good places to start maybe building from those voices and then crafting something around it. But to answer your question, I think it's impossible to divorce narratives from the choices we make and the choices we think we can make. And of course, the futures we think we can create. Does that make sense? Cool.
Go ahead, Ken.
Oh, man. Yikes.
You would be
Yikes.
a relevant commentator.
I'm curious how do you use the term capitalism? As you may recall, I'm skeptical about the use of that, particularly the conflation of capitalism as a system of ownership of capital with markets. And I don't know if you saw that one piece on how, drawing from Adam Smith, the people who least want the ideal of free markets are the owners of capital. That's one of the great ironies, and if you express that in terms of are free markets anti-capitalist? And so I wonder how do you use that term? And to that too is when I describe my own view, people ask me socialist, capitalist, whatever. I say non-ideological, because what I'm most emphatic against is the way in which we propose and judge policies on the basis of a conformity to some kind of theoretical model. So, for example, when you hear today, well, we can't do that because that would be socialistic. But I also hear that from Marxists too. The Kashmir book is, I think, a primary example of that, where criticism of Mondragon is basically it doesn't conform to her Marxist model. And I mean, the question should be, is it improving the quality of people's lives? So in that sense, I mean, I'm a pragmatist. I see these models, these theories as tools, conceptual tools for the improvement of human living. And so it's a task of when does this tool, as opposed to that tool, work best in this particular context, and avoid the universalizing, the idea that there's one tool that fits all situations and so forth. Anyway, so I'm just curious, how do you come to use the word capitalism?
Emphasizing the particular over the universal is sort of the strain of this project, and I think when, at least in the the literature that's been published in this stuff, when we think about capitalism, or when we're talking about capitalism, right, one thing we're not talking about is what we see most other people thinking. The capital C thing looming in the sky, where your identity is fixed to this capital thing, everything is capital centric. But it's a good question we're not talking about capitalism in that way. We're talking about a certain class process, right, of production, appropriation, and distribution. However, I don't think that there is just one way in which a capitalist system would organize around production, appropriation, and distribution. So I don't know. I think that's something that needs to be a lot more clear, both in my own presentation, and then I think when we're thinking about class processes, what do capitalist class processes look like? I mean, we can always say there's the tenets of wage labor and appropriation for people who don't produce, and distribution in this unequal way. But I don't know. That's something I need to be, I think, a bit more clear on.
I have another question.
Love it.
So You mentioned at the very outset that Ken's very strange friendship with Deirdre McCluskey was important to your development. And of course, Deirdre McCluskey has this overarching theory of what she calls the bourgeois deal.
Yeah.
That, as a matter of fact, we're all so much better off. This very much builds on Ken's question. We're all so much better off as a result of the kind of capitalism that depends on a particular sort of, and she says it's moral economy in the sense that people have to trust one another to basically pay their debts. But it's not just about that, it's also risk. There's risk involved whenever you enter into financial ventures. And so she's really fascinated by the Medicis, and she's really fascinated by how it is that everybody's better off when capitalism is at its healthiest. And I really think that might be at the bottom of his question. It's like, what's healthy capitalism, in your opinion? Is that not a part of what you're worried about?
What is,
Tell me what healthy capitalism looks like.
Maybe a little bit of a loaded gun, right? I can't.
I know, but you said you like being drilled, and I don't.
I do, yeah. I very much so. But I think, you know, I can't tell you what like a healthy capitalism is, and I don't think that anyone can. However, at least not in this camp. Not in this camp. Deirdre McCloskey,
Yes.
maybe you definitely
That's
can.
that's her whole theory.
Yeah. You know, on one hand, you can always say, you know, we're non-ideological or something like that. But I think that in this camp specifically, in the people writing about anti-essentialist Marxism, one hesitation I have, which we might share, is, okay, all these things are determined, everything is equally, you know, causing everything else, and then why do we spend so much time talking about resisting capitalism? You know, and if there are these infinite number of causes, right, production, distribution, and appropriation, 3 doesn't equal infinite, you know, and so I experience this tension too, and I am not out of it yet. So I think I sympathize with both of you while trying to remain, you know, trying to hold up a position here.
I don't think I've stated a position. I'm just curious as to your opinion of the bourgeois deal. I mean, are we allowed to be bourgeois in your version of anti-essentialist Marxism? I mean, it's like, and I want to know whether I'm evil.
Well, totally, right.
I'm totally evil.
You know, I feel so unpluralist if I say no. You can't be bourgeois, right? I mean, I think maybe at the end of the day, maybe, and who cares what we call it, right?
Yeah,
But
on that.
if we do think of capitalism as a system of wage labor exploitation, well then no, right? Because what we are having a project rooted in Marxian thought, I think, means that what we're progressing towards is this idea of class justice based on substantial freedom and equality, right? Not the formal freedom and equality of this, you know, system. So I don't know. That's a tough question. I think, you know, my suspicion is to say, you know, definitely not. You can't be bourgeois, but that does seem to run into some tension here that I haven't quite figured out.
Tension that those of us who are radicals who do well continually confront, right?
Yeah. So apart from my academic work, I consult for a lot of social enterprises and things like that, right? And the tagline is always doing good while doing well.
Yeah.
You know, and
that sounds like Deirdre McCluskey.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And right, every time I hear this, I think, oh God, are you serious? You know, I think that's not right. You know, and then
we must suffer.
Yeah, I have a hard time digging myself out of that, and so I've been at this tension for like 2 or 3 years now. So you know, if anyone has any ideas of how to make this, I think, more logically consistent, I'm all open. You know, all ears for it. But yeah, I don't know. My there's something inside of me that thinks like, no, like this bourgeois deal thing just doesn't happen, and it's I think a danger of this position without it being fully fleshed out, that you can easily slide into just do whatever, kind of whatever works, and then you do lose that you know, that power that Marx gives us of explaining, you know, certain things in certain ways. You know.
Say, McCluskey and I, we probably disagree on far more than we agree on.
Oh, I know.
Yeah.
I know.
I mean,
That was in question.
But, I mean, the friendship in large part is her irreverence for the profession. It's just wonderful. And she sees herself as an economist in the tradition of moral philosophy, that economics needs to be rooted the bourgeois ideal, I think is,
Well, I saw your own students be very disturbed by her bourgeois deal, but that said, I still think that there's something about the relationship between materialism, need,
Absolutely.
and what you might call the Marxian ethical context. I really like Cornel West's book on the ethical dimension of Marxist thought, which detaches it from the materialist's perspective and associates it with the pragmatists. And it enables you to be a radical while still buying into something like the order of Morris, or the order of love. But it's absolutely necessary to detach it from materialism. The critique of capital remains, but the critique of capital is altered by the absence of materialism, because you have to have a new ontology.
Yeah.
And Ken's ontology is a personalist process ontology of the order of Morris, the order of love, which in your own biography, you emphasize this. And of course, that sounds so hippy-dippy. Just like, okay, we love Marx's radicalism and we love his critique of capital, but now what we're going to do is, instead of materialism and need, we're going to plug in love. And that's radical, I grant. It sounds like Jesus or something. You look a little like Jesus, and so that's...
should have seen me with my beard.
Yeah, right. But instead of materialism and need, what we're going to do is say, blessed are the poor in spirit, not blessed are the poor. Which, by the way, the Gospels disagree on that point. Sometimes it's blessed are the poor, and sometimes it's blessed are the poor in spirit. And you, I hear say, blessed are the poor in spirit.
Yeah, you are absolutely giving words to, I think my personal biggest problem is, right, I'm very steeped in this materialist thought, and there's power in material explanations, right? There's something qualitatively distinct about the capitalist mode of production, about the way class emerges. And, in one of my mentor's words, right, this feels a little decaf to that. And as someone in the conference said, it's more like a watered down coffee sock. I'm sympathetic to that because I feel it as well. But I think that there's something about this that's really compelling to me, and I don't yet know what it is. But I want to see it pushed to the limit, and I think that's why I continue to rapidly prototype this idea and get growth for it and things, because I feel like, yes, there's something lost. There's something Marxist, and maybe even the most important thing about Marxism that's lost here. But there's something here that I think needs to keep going, and we need to figure out what that is. Maybe other people have a bunch. I haven't, and I think a lot of us haven't either. So.
Well, when I think of Ken, I think of a radical, but I do not think of a Marxist.
Yeah.
Anyway, when I think of Zach, I'm wondering what kind of radical.
Oh man, me too. So, to be honest with you, but yeah. So I don't know. This is.
All right, I'm being too hard on you.
Oh, you're great. Turn it up a notch.
Are there other pressing questions? No. All right, then we've come to a natural end.
Wonderful.
Zach, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.